In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Last week's presidential debate was the biggest event on the political calendar between now and the election. America was watching, with over 67 million people tuned in, and Kamala Harris absolutely dominated the stage, sharp, confident, and deft in her attacks, while Donald Trump came off as cranky, out of touch, and at points unhinged, as with his ludicrous claim that immigrants are allegedly eating good Americans' pets in Springfield, Ohio. Yet, it's not clear that such a widely watched and decisive drubbing will move the election needle. The burning question remains, after nearly a decade of Trump overload, who out there is left to be swayed, and where will the crucial votes that tip the scales come from? Even as Harris supporters rejoiced over the lopsided victory, they steeled themselves for indications that the deadlock is unbroken. Meanwhile, Trump, ever the snake oil seller, proclaimed himself the debate winner and insisted there's no need for another face-off. After the debate, Harris and Tim Walz hit the campaign ground running with a series of stops in battleground states, blanketing in particular the western region of Pennsylvania, the state that as of now is shaping up to be ground zero in the entire campaign. Trump, meanwhile, made campaign stops in the western battlegrounds of Arizona and Nevada, where he seemed to be at his most vicious and deceitful. To take stock of a campaign that is moving into its official home stretch, with the candidates seemingly neck and neck, and huge uncertainty about what is signal and what is noise, we welcome three of the sharpest and most experienced political analysts in the country, all returning guests and friends of the podcast. And they are Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes the weekly column on life in Washington. She's written several books, including The Divider with Peter Baker, which we covered in a Talking Books episode. Always a pleasure to welcome you. Thanks for joining, Susan.
Oh, so happy to be with you. Thank you.
Molly Jong-Fast, a political analyst for MSNBC, a special correspondent for Vanity Fair, host of the podcast Fast Politics with Molly Jong-Fast, and a regular guest on our Molly Mashup, where we exchange politics and legal questions. Molly, thanks for being here. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
And Jacob Weisberg, executive chair and co-founder of Pushkin Industries. He was previously CEO of the Slate Group, co-founder of Panoply, and editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine. He's the author of several books, and he serves as chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you, Jacob, for returning.
Thanks, Harry. Great to be here.
The first, and apparently only, as Donald Trump would have it anyway, debate between Trump and Kamala Harris took place last week, which feels both like it just happened and that it was weeks ago. So the very broad consensus is that it was lopsidedly a Harris victory, with the range of opinions, Donald Trump's aside, that she posted anything from a solid win to a rout. So we and listeners, I think, have absorbed the first reaction to the debate, but I just wanted to pose a couple follow-up questions about what's arguably the most important event in the whole campaign, from conventions to election. So, setting the content to the side for the moment, you've heard this test of who wins a debate based on just turning off the volume and what's the kind of music as opposed to words. I just wanted to ask your sense of her performance, both of them, from that vantage point, not just the policy back and forth, but the kind of vibe and personality that each projected.
I'll take the bait and go first, taking the bait being a theme from the debate. In my house, we have to spell out the word walk because if our dog hears it, he starts jumping up and down.
100% the same, literally.
It is Pavlovian, Trump's response. And she was like, it was so calculated, not just that she tweaked him up at his rallies, but that she said they were bad entertainment. And, you could just see him absolutely unable to respond in any way but what he did. And that's what got him off balance. I mean, before that, the first 20 minutes of the debate, Kamala was kind of nervous and she really didn't answer at all the first question on the economy. And I was worried, but with that, I thought it switched decisively in her direction. I mean, the thing that is a little mystifying to me or frustrating to me is why the numbers aren't moving the way they should be. Her performance, the convention was excellent, incredibly strong. I couldn't really think of a way to improve it. She did extremely well in the debate. He did extremely poorly. He's at his relative peak craziness and absurdity, and the numbers aren't moving. So what's going on? Are there no persuadable voters? Has it just not happened yet? But it's really worrisome. It suggests that maybe there's nothing she can be doing that will be giving her any kind of margin of safety. I think it's still pretty close to a 50-50 race right now.
And we will get to that. Susan actually wrote about it. But does Molly or Susan, either of you have thoughts about the volume off test?
Try reading the transcript of this debate, and you will be even more convinced than you probably already are if you're listening to this very wise podcast. That means, of course, you have excellent taste and you already, are a very discerning political consumer. But if you read the transcript of the debate, I did go back and look at it the other day, it will reinforce, and certainly a radio listening of the debate would also reinforce the incredible, monumental incoherence of Donald Trump. And again, is that new in 2024? No, it's not. He's always had a challenge with what you might call the grammar of English. He doesn't speak in sentences that have nouns, verbs, and periods in them. However, there's incoherence and then there's incoherence. And I thought CNN did quite an effective video the other day in which they contrasted Trump's answer on immigration from one of his 2016 debates with Hillary Clinton and his answer on immigration with Harris this week. And that was, of course, also an answer that included the incredible detour around him defending his rallies from her terrible insult that people might actually be bored by them and walking out early. But I think that it answers your question, Harry, to a certain extent, which is that if in the past Trump's riffing kind of unconventional style might have gained him fans, at this point, it tends to reinforce and underscore the very questions around his fitness for office, his aging, his incapacity, which I think are the key for Harris if she is going to defeat him. But I do want to just underscore also, though, what Jacob said. Let's be real. It is extraordinary that 9 years into this ordeal, the American public is apparently so divided, and a certain core of the Republican electorate is so probably, just partisan, so concerned about the Democratic Party that they're willing to attach themselves to a man who is increasingly disconnected from any meaningful version of reality, including that of a very hardened partisan Republican.
And not just a certain core. What Jacob's suggesting is there's nothing but the core, even what we've taken to be the small stratum, but we'll get to it. I did want to say, I thought the split screen, they should have known, this came up with Biden, but worked very much to his disadvantage. He was dour and upset and had very unpersuasive kind of smiles like a third grader when she needled him and stuff. It did feel to me, sound on, sound off. It was a sound whooping.
I think the general consensus is that she won. But again, Hillary Clinton won all of her debates too, right? And he refused to debate the primary challengers. And then he won the debate with Biden. And he basically just won because he wasn't about him, right? And nobody noticed him. But there was a group of undecided voters who watched the Biden-Trump debate who, while Biden was obviously something different, they were saying that they didn't particularly like Trump either. The problem with polling for Trump is that Trump has historically turned out the ones and twos, the people who never go out, right? Those are the people who don't vote, who almost never vote. So if he gets those people again, it's impossible to know what those numbers will look like, because that's the hidden Trump voter that Kellyanne loves, right? That's the voter that is not usually polled, right? Because they don't usually vote.
And probably wasn't even watching the debate, right?
Right. But the question is, will those people come out again? Does he have the same number of them? Remember, he lost by 7 million votes in 2020, by 5 million votes in 2016. So I just wonder, and if you look at a lot of these states, you'll have on the top of the ticket, it'll be very, very tight. You'll have her winning by 1 point, or they'll be even, it'll be a dead heat. Bottom of the ticket, you'll look at the Senate race, you'll have like Wisconsin. So you have Tammy Baldwin winning by 8 points, 10 points. So what they're trying to do here is they're trying to do this sort of voodoo math to get the top of the ticket to poll these never show up voters, the ones and twos. The question is, so if the ones and twos do show up, do they leave the bottom of the ticket blank? That seems crazy to me. So are there voters who will vote for Tammy Baldwin and Trump? That's my big problem with all these polls, is that it doesn't jive, right? That you'll have all these Tammy Baldwin voters and then it'll be tight. So I think there's a scenario where the actual results are closer to the bottom of the ticket, or where the actual results are closer to the top of the ticket, because you can't have, I don't see a world where you could have both.
Can I just speak up 2 sentences in defense of the much maligned polling? And again, I there are important critiques to be made, but let's remember that actually the polls in 2016, unlike these statistical methods and these models, which were, I'm still traumatized by that, but the actual surveys before the 2016 election had Hillary up by almost exactly nationally what she won by. That was, more or less true, a little bit less so for Biden in 2020. One of the problems for understanding what was going to happen in 2016 is that there weren't good, reliable state level polls in the immediate run up in places like Michigan. So again, the reason I'm saying it is because I'm still feel pretty burned. And I think the country was ill-served by a lot of Democrats who basically jumped on the bandwagon of poll denialism earlier this year because it suited them, because they were continuing to puff up Joe Biden's chances, which were incredibly looking bleaker and bleaker and bleaker. And basically, a lot of Democrats started to do what we had heard from Republicans all along, which is essentially forum shopping. Like, well, I don't like it, so I'm just going to say that it's wrong. And I think that if there's challenges in our institutions, one of my big takeaways from the last 9 years is we better be grounded in what's wrong, what's fixable, what's unknowable. And I do think that you're making a great point, which is what is a likely voter in this age of shifting turnout and shifting alliances. And clearly the pollsters in key states are struggling with that. So again, I actually do agree with you, but
I'm just saying you can't have the bottom of the ticket and the top of the ticket look so different in the same election. And so either the bottom is right or the top is right. And either one means it's a very bad night for Democrats. The other means it's a very good night for Democrats. And I just don't see how you can have such a chasm between the two. That is all I'm saying. It is not one way or the other. And what's happening is there is the way they're polling Trump is different than the way they're polling all the other candidates, which may be right, but it's kind of malpractice-y, because if those people come out for Trump, won't they vote for the other Republicans?
I was just going to say, when I go to, Nate Silver's site, I'm paying much more attention to the battleground state polls than I am the national poll, because as Susan referred to, a gap of how many million points in a national poll would give Harris a margin of safety, unclear. But if she gets a significant margin in the half dozen battleground states, we're all going to breathe a lot easier. And it's why those down ballot races and state organizations are so important. Tammy Baldwin turns people out to vote for her. As Molly says, almost all of those people will also vote for Harris. And that's why it matters where they control the state houses in Pennsylvania and Michigan, North Carolina. It's going to come down to turnout, organization, and what other races in the state are affecting the race, I think.
Look, it's a really good point. Mike Podhorzer in particular is excellent on it, the disconnect between national polls in one point or two and what really matters, not even the swing states, but districts within the swing states, that it's just very hard for us to have reliable polling on. Let me ask just one more thing about what the debate achieved or didn't, and then let's move back to polling. But Harris, she seemed to succeed in almost all goals, and maybe more importantly, from what the pollsters more sophisticated explained, he flubbed it repeatedly. One thing that was hard for her is to try to be the candidate of change without disavowing Biden's record, et cetera. Do you think she has succeeded?
I'd frame it a little differently here. I think Trump failed to successfully associate her with Biden in the debate, but I don't think she has solved the problem from her end of working with Biden's record, but around Biden. I mean, I think, she's doing okay with it. It's very tricky. And I think you saw it in the debate when she talked about the economy. I think objectively, the economy is very defensible and very strong, but she doesn't want to defend the Biden administration's economic record because she doesn't want to be associated with the unpopularity of the economy.
She knows it's a hard sell. Yeah.
Inflation in particular. So I think she's in just an inherently super difficult position. And you have to think that the Trump campaign is going to continue to hone that line of attack and draw a line under the fact that it's Harris-Biden administration and the Harris-Biden economy.
If Harris is going to win, it's in part because Trump is maybe not an incumbent, but closer to being an incumbent than anyone else who was a Republican nominee after 4 years of a Democratic administration would be. I think it's really important to underscore that Trump just visibly projects he's the past. He's already been 4 years in office. We haven't elected a former president to the office. Several have tried, but no one succeeded since Grover Cleveland. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason that Harris, both in the debate and in many of her rally appearances and public speeches, what is she doing? She's emphasizing it's the same old tired playbook. That's a phrase you've heard from her from the very beginning of her campaign. She used it repeatedly the other night in the debate. She visibly, obviously, is the change, not only as the first woman of color on a major party ticket, but generationally, she is the change that Americans across party lines said they were hungry for earlier this year. And I'm very mindful of Nikki Haley's statement in the primaries in, I think it was January of this year. She said the first party that replaces its nearly 80-something nominee on the ticket will be the winner this fall. Of course, how much you want to take Nikki Haley seriously. She's the person who said Donald Trump was unhinged and is voting for him anyways. But I do think that it's, in a very obvious sense, Harris is change, right? She is generational change. She is demographic change. She represents, a change of perspective as well, an emphasis that she sort of signaled at without, explicitly breaking with Biden on various policy issues. So I think that's kind of what the race comes down to. If it's about Donald Trump, my view is that Harris will win. If he succeeds in landing some blows or events conspire to put the scrutiny more on the Biden and Harris record, then it would be more of a question mark. But I have come out of this kind of amazing political year reinforced in the view that there is actually a kind of durable but perilously small but durable anti-Trump, non-Trump majority in this country. And so then the question is...
And always has been, really, right?
How does it shake out? Exactly.
I think what Susan said is totally right. And I also think that he is not in the majority. And what happened in 2016, I mean, again, could he win? For sure. But part of what happened in 2016 was this idea that it was a fait accompli. And I think that is why Harris has been so careful every time to say they're behind, they're running from behind. But I also think that he has a ceiling, right? He has people he can't lose, but he has people he can't win.
And they're more of the latter. Susan, you wrote after the debate and election this close, you would think that a drubbing like the one Trump received on Tuesday night ought to matter at least a bit. And yet we're all poised for news that notwithstanding the decisive debate, we are still in a dead heat. So seriously, if the debate didn't move the needle, really, what could between now and then other than some October surprise? Or does it mean like we are frozen, across the entire spectrum?
You know what, guys? Look at not only Donald Trump's approval rating today, look at it in July on the day that Joe Biden dropped out. Do you know what the difference was? When I last checked this a few days ago, it was 0.1%. And guess what? Go back and look 4 years ago. That will really freak you out because it is also exactly the same. Literally exactly the same. You could say that the Trump movement has become more extreme, like its leader, because in effect, Trump has taken them to places and himself to places that we never thought we could go. He's now a convicted felon. He wasn't that 4 years ago. He's now not only gotten away, as he sees it, with the election denialism, which is the first time in American history a leader of either party has refused to accept the results of a legitimate election, but he's now reversed his views on January 6th such that the people are not only not rioters, but they're heroes and martyrs. And he's taking those people. So it's the same people, but just like Donald Trump is the same, but even wackier and potentially more destabilizing 4 years later, I think his followers, it's the same percentage of America, but it's a more radical movement, in my view, than it was 4 years ago.
There's a kind of brilliant piece in the New York Times that Michael Hirshhorn wrote about Trump and reality TV. Michael Hirshhorn is a reality TV producer, and he talks about the rise of the villain in reality TV shows as hugely successful. He talks about, I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but Richard Hatch on Survivor. And everybody hated him, and the more they hated him, the more they loved him in a way. And there is this kind of, not to get too metaphysical, but this, blurring of the reality of politics with the fake drama of reality TV and the way in which villains are also heroes because they're so compelling and watchable. And I have to think that that's part of the explanation, or at least I think it's one of the better explanations of how Trump continues to get this kind of support sort of despite everything. And what it points to is, no, there's no bottom. There's nothing that he could do that would change that dynamic. And in a way, the worse he behaves, the better, because it makes him better entertainment. And, anybody you can lose on the basis of responsibility didn't support Trump 8 years ago. And that's sort of a disturbing prospect, even though I think there's a real insight there.
All shows get canceled. In the end, all shows end.
Molly Jong-Fast calls it World 2. Look, it is a harrowing prospect because you wonder, okay, we're focused either on these very narrow stratum of swing voters. Are they 11? Are they 25? Possibly some turnout increase that Harris is able to marshal, for instance, in North Carolina. But what he's been able to do in the past is have some people who nobody was taking account of at all somehow show up come election day. So they were literally invisible to the pundits. But that also seems crazy because it's sort of the point you raised, Susan. Who could possibly not have an opinion about him now? To whom are they addressing their arguments?
You want to hear something that keeps me up at night? Pennsylvania has not ever elected a woman on top of the ticket. Ever.
And that's my home state. Have they had many chances?
No women governor, no women senators.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And they are the state she must win.
Yeah.
Yeah, we agree there.
If you want to stay up at night, think about that.
We were already all staying up at night on different stuff.
Right.
What is it about? I mean, because that's a sort of intriguing data point, Molly, what is it about Pennsylvania that makes it different from Michigan or, other states where it doesn't seem to be an issue?
I don't know. They elected a Jew, but they've never elected a woman at statewide office. I don't know what it is, but that is a little worrying to me.
It's my old home state. They do say, Pittsburgh to the west, which is sort of culturally conservative, though maybe fiscally liberal, Philadelphia to the east, and Alabama in between. So,
And she's spending a lot of time in Pittsburgh and not a lot of time in Philly.
Alabama has had a women governor.
Kay Ivey. They have one now. The
exactly.
worst. Yeah.
I think, Molly, that's a really important point. And by the way, Pennsylvania in general is more worrisome for Democrats than Michigan and Wisconsin. And I remember speaking a few years ago with Jake Sullivan, who's now Biden's national security advisor, but people forget he was Hillary Clinton's closest aide and really was a domestic and foreign policy advisor in 2016. He was really her right-hand person. And, he would always say, look, in an election as close as 2016, you can point to any one of our screw-ups. You can say that it was James Comey's fault. You can say that it's our fault because Hillary didn't go to Michigan before the election, which she should have done, and she only lost Michigan by a few thousand votes. He said, but, and this was a big caveat that I've always remembered, he said, the truth is that we lost Pennsylvania and we threw everything we had at Pennsylvania. Remember, they had the convention there in 2016. They sent Obama there for the big final rally. They were in the state constantly. And in his view, and this is kind of a disturbing view because I think it, undercuts the kind of things that Democrats have been telling themselves for 8 years to help themselves fall asleep at night. But, in his view, they did everything possible that they could in Pennsylvania, and they just lost to Donald Trump there.
You can imagine, if you think of the order in which states are coming in, that were she to take Pennsylvania, Michigan, and North Carolina, a lot of the anxiety goes away. Okay, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let's focus on each campaign just a little. Everything you guys are saying suggests to me that Trump, not by happenstance, but purposefully, notwithstanding having been not really found his footing in the debate, what we're expecting should be just, if it were possible, we're at 256 or 512 or whatever, a redoubling of the lies. Molly, you had a good piece in Vanity Fair about really some, even by Trumpian standards, just crazy ass stuff about, people being taken out of school and have their gender changed without the parents knowing, etc. Now that basically what's left is not face-to-face, but just home crowds, should we just expect Trump to the highest, steroid crazy level ever? Does he do nothing to try to address all the ways in which he is not liked?
I mean, this has always been the thing with Trump. He never wants to grow the electorate. He never wants to go out and win voters. I mean, remember his inauguration speech, Fire and Fury, right? That was some weird shit. Says George W. Bush, right?
Right.
Famous liberal George W. Bush.
When's he going to endorse Harris?
I think never, but Susan probably knows better than I do.
He won't vote for Donald Trump, but he seems determined to not say anything in public.
But I would say he's not interested in growing the electorate, or he's incapable, right? Or he doesn't know to even want to grow the electorate. Maybe it's that. But I would say the post-truth stuff is especially worrying. And I wrote that before the "they're eating dogs" comment, right? Which is a racist lie that targets Haitians and is both now getting schools closed, bomb threats called in. I mean, this poor town in Ohio, which had the bad luck of just being on Trump's radar, right? Remember in 2016, he had the Muslims. Now he has the Haitians. And it's just like it's spinning a wheel of fortune. These poor people who are being targeted. And if you go online, if you go on Twitter and you say, they're not eating dogs, that's unequivocally, no one is saying that but Donald Trump. They will say, just like J.D. Vance, they'll say, well, there's some places where da-da-da, like some lie, but this is the slipping into post-truth. And the question is, you'll remember with the 2020 election, the Republican who said, well, he's going to say he won, he'll file a few lawsuits, then he'll go play golf. What's the harm? He's not hurting anyone. Meanwhile, now more Republicans than not believe the 2020 election was stolen. So what happens with the dog lie, right? What happens? It keeps going. Somebody gets killed. Somebody gets... where does it end? And then he picks another group. So he gets sick of Haitians and he picks this one or that one. I mean, it is like we're going down a rabbit hole where we can't necessarily come back.
I think, Molly, that's not all he's doing. I mean, alongside the hate mongering and anti-woke stuff, focused particularly on immigrants, you have, I guess, what I'd call positive pandering, where he's throwing out random tax cuts every week. His most recent one is there should be no taxes on overtime. And he, without any sense of responsibility in the event that he were elected and would be held to any of this, he will be giving out candy that may sound pretty good to people, because there are a lot of people who are wage earners in this country who get overtime and may hear that message and think, no taxes on overtime, like no taxes on tips. That all sounds pretty good to me. And Harris can't match that pandering because she has a fundamental sense of responsibility as someone who, may be in this position and can't say things that she has absolutely no intention of doing. And in a way, that's what worries me more. I mean, I think that hate stuff fuels up the crowds. It provokes. He's baiting us in the way Harris baited him in the debate. I mean, we never fail to react to any of that.
But she did excellent in not taking the bait every time, right? That was one of her strengths, actually.
I don't think she doesn't take the bait, but I'm saying we're incapable of not responding to the talking about dog eating. But at the same time, while we're distracted by that shiny object, he's actually doing a more conventional kind of irresponsible political pandering that may actually be very helpful and that I think it's very hard for her to compete with.
But I do think there's a moral imperative to defend Haitians against this scurrilous claim. And as a Jew, I feel very passionately that I want, if nothing else, I will have defended a group of people that are being maligned unfairly. And I feel like it's a moral question more than a political question.
Well, it's also a political question. Let's be real, is that if one of the main goals of Kamala Harris right now is to underscore in the way that actually drove Joe Biden from the race, that Donald Trump has neither the fitness or the mental capacity at his age, never mind with his psychological state, whatever it is, to perform the office of President of the United States. That has to be one of her main points that she makes. He is making that point for her. So I am totally here for all of that. I've watched a million of them. The dog and cat videos, the TikToks on the internet where they've set it to music. And I mean, I say, great, have that enter the culture. Because I think that actually, Jacob, like I take the point about the reality show star, but I actually think that that's sort of a somewhat dated view of Trump. And I think that the 2024 view that's really been able to coalesce now that Harris is the candidate and not Biden is the sort of Trump jumped the shark and literally is talking about sharks and electric boats Trump. And that seeing that enter the culture and all of the, kind of explosion of memes around Harris's candidacy and, they ate the dogs. I mean, come on. When we think back to what are people going to remember about the 2024 campaign? I don't know a lot of it, but I feel pretty confident that it's going to go in the history of American presidential debates. There was Jerry Ford and the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Well, how does that stack up as a gaffe in a presidential debate compared to they're eating the dogs?
Well, and you tweeted it at the time. There's a really interesting contrast here. Gerald Ford, 3 days later, would never have repeated that total gaffe. And yet they're doubling down. So it does actually suggest that part of him, is thinking you cannot go too low.
I do want to address Molly's point, though, about post-truth, because I think Jacob's right that, we journalists in particular are Pavlovian in that we feel compelled to respond to untruths and lies. And one of the paradoxes of Trump from the beginning of his time in public life is that it has almost broken us on our own foundational principle. The Washington Post fact checker found at the end of Trump's presidency that he had a record of something like 30,000 false statements, untruths, disinformation, misinformation. Okay, 30,000. In that debate alone, we've had a situation where Republican defenders of Trump, because they couldn't really defend his performance, have been criticizing the moderators for what? For, quote, fact-checking Donald Trump. How dare they do that? Well, guess what? They only fact-checked him on 3 of his more egregious statements. That, A, they're not eating the dogs. Another fact check was, a simple, very important statement. Crime is not going up in this country. It's going down in this country. But if you listen to Donald Trump, he gets these crazy, wild, inflated statements. He literally said in that debate, and this was not fully fact-checked, that they were emptying out Venezuelan jails and sending all the criminals from Venezuela to America and that the crime rate in Venezuela has plummeted as a result. Like, this is not true. What are some other untrue things that he said in the debate? He said that Democrats want to have abortions of babies after they're born. This is not true. He says that Kamala Harris is a Marxist. This is not true. Things that, again, I think CNN found several dozen untruths that Trump made in the debate versus I think it was one or two by Kamala Harris.
It's been really a hallmark of her campaign so far, the way she's, by and large, left it off. And it's of a piece with what you wrote, Molly, about how maybe the vistas for female candidates have been enlarged by people who came before, because she is able, in a way, maybe previous women candidates haven't been, to just like kind of the way Obama actually, this was his sort of gesture. And I was thinking of exactly that when Jacob was making the 100% accurate point that we get revved up and nuts. And they've hit on a pretty good strategy, which she's connected to tired old playbook, turn the page.
Well, I was going to say the only place Susan and I disagree, I think, is that Susan thinks Trump is getting worse and deteriorating. And I think he's basically exactly the same. And it's possible that he could become senile and crazier and more dangerous. And probably given his age, it's something to really worry about. But he's essentially the same guy he was in 2016 and 2020. And I could, give you a list of outrageous and provocative statements that do exactly the same thing and are every bit as bad. This is the one that, you come up with a particularly memorable one. And I'm all for making a mockery of him for saying it to the extent you can. But Trump doesn't change. He's the same. This is what he does.
Jacob, I take your point that he is essentially the same person, but add 9 years and the deterioration is real. Go look at that video of the 2016 debates with Hillary. He is much, much less capable of sustaining an argument, even his crazy over-the-top demagogic argument. He's much less capable of doing that. His vocabulary has further shrunken. He is very clearly now talking around words and people and names that he's forgotten in the way that are very familiar to me from dealing with aging parents and grandparents over the years. He is making many more kind of binary statements. There was an excellent article in the Health News Service Stat recently that I recommend to all of Harry's listeners that had people do content analysis, vocabulary analysis, content analysis of some of Trump's 2024 speeches, contrasting that with 2017 when they undertook the same exercise. And it's really notable. So I take your point, like as a person, he is definitely the same. As a demagogue, he is emphasizing almost to an uncanny extent the same fantastical issues. He was saying back in 2016, we're not going to have a country anymore, blah, blah, blah. So again, I think your big picture observation is correct, but I actually do think within the frame of Trump may have, he is actually deteriorated in a way that would be understandable for 9 years more.
Yeah, and I think you can use the same tool. I mean, look, he's 10 years older and his vocabulary shrink. The same was true of George W. Bush at a much younger age. The same is true of Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan eventually, did succumb to Alzheimer's, so you could say that told us where he was going. At some point, it happens to everybody. But I guess my primary reaction to Trump at this point is not that he's falling apart, but to the contrary, he's still doing quite intentionally what he's setting out to do. So anyway, it's a small point. I don't want to belabor it.
Although maybe we can combine the points. So, I mean, I was really struck in the debate. Whenever he was on the defensive, what came up right away? Thousands and millions of immigrants flowing over. In other words, when he's rocked, he retreats to a pretty small universe of crazy charges.
One of the things I've noticed with Trump was in 2016, he was able, he would do like 5 stops in a day. Maybe not 5, but he'd do 2, 3 rallies. And, he'd be on that plane, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. And I kept thinking to myself, he's going to so many places and she's spending the weekend in the Hamptons, right? Like fundraising. I'd be like, what is happening here? And one of the cases against Biden was that Biden could not campaign, right? That he was too tired to jump on the plane and go, and because it's a very tough job. And I really do see that Trump just does not have the energy to do the kind of campaigning he did in 2016. He has many fewer appearances. When he gets to a rally, it's still 2 hours long, and it's probably an hour longer than it should be. But, I mean, there are days when he just plays golf.
It's now time to take a moment for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and topics that are prominent in the news. Today's sidebar is about the Equal Pay Act, the law that requires that men and women in the same workplace be given equal pay for equal work. And to explain this topic, I am thrilled to welcome D'Arcy Carden. D'Arcy Carden is an actress and comedian. Maybe like me, you were blown away and delighted by her portrayal of Janet in the NBC sitcom The Good Place, for which she earned a nomination for a Primetime Emmy Award and a campaign to get her to do a sidebar on Talking Feds. She's also well known for portraying Greta Gill in the Prime series A League of Their Own. She also played Gemma in Broad City and Natalie Greer in the HBO dark comedy series Barry, with Talking Feds friend Henry Winkler. She recently made her Broadway debut in The Thanksgiving Play. And with that, I give you D'Arcy Carden on the Equal Pay Act.
Federal law includes multiple provisions designed to outlaw wage discrimination based on sex. The chief protection is the Equal Pay Act, which President John F. Kennedy signed into law in 1963. The act requires that employers pay employees equal rates for jobs that require, quote, equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and which are performed under similar working conditions. Thus, the law attempts to compare and equalize the value of different jobs. Skill refers to accountability, education, and training. Effort refers to the level of exertion required to complete the task. Responsibility refers to the accountability attendant to the role. In passing the Equal Pay Act, Congress recognized that wage discrimination by sex is not only unfair, it also leads to numerous economic problems while generating labor disputes. To make a claim under the EPA, an employee files a claim under the law or Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, or both. The employee must demonstrate that 1, wages are unequal between sexes, 2, the work done by the two groups is generally equivalent, and 3, the work is completed under similar conditions. The EPA allows for unequal pay in the following situations: 1, a seniority system, 2, a merit system, 3, wages match quantitative or qualitative earnings measured, or 4, are distinguished by a factor other than gender. Since it passed the EPA, Congress has bolstered protections against wage discrimination by sex through a number of laws, including the Education Amendments of 1972, which extended protections to female professionals and executives, and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which makes each unequal paycheck a violation of the EPA. But despite the significant legal protections, wage discrimination by sex has proven extremely difficult to eradicate. When the Equal Pay Act was passed, women, who then made up a third of the workforce, were paid on average 59 cents for every dollar made by a man. 60 years later, women make up 56.8% of the American workforce, and they are paid on average 84 cents for every dollar a man is paid. And the disparity is even greater for women of Black and Hispanic descent. Limitations of the law include the difficulty of proving the existence of gender discrimination in pay. Employers may also not be deterred by the relatively lax punishments set by the law. These gaps are also enforced by occupational segregation, which steers women towards careers in education and domestic work that are less financially lucrative. Finally, there is scant protection in existing labor laws to address pregnancy discrimination or unconscious gender bias. For Talking Feds, I'm D'Arcy Carden.
Thank you so much, D'Arcy. An absolute favorite of Talking Feds, me and the entire team. D'Arcy's latest project, The Netflix original series Nobody Wants This premieres September 26th. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we hop into the beer cooler to ask the question, to IPA or not IPA? The India Pale Ale has become synonymous with the word hoppy. And it's that hoppiness that's created a bittersweet relationship with IPAs that has divided beer lovers across the world into two categories. Those who love this style of the pale ale for its full flavored bite with flavors of lemon and pine needle, plus typically higher alcohol content. And then those who prefer a little less sharpness with each sip. So what gives IPAs that signature bite? Well, there's another abbreviation you should know, IBU, which stands for International Bitterness Units. The higher the IBU, the more bitter the beer. Luckily, at Total Wine & More, we carry an array of IPAs that offer up a huge range of hoppiness. We've all been bitten by a hoppy IPA in our past. Swing by your local Total Wine & More and let our guides find you an IPA that's more YOU. So find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. I see a sort of a theme in the whole, or a question that this whole conversation raises, which is everything just completely determined and there's just no room to maneuver at all? What are you looking for, I guess? What can we all look for that can say, somebody is, thinking strategically, or somebody has concluded they're down? Or is it where Harris goes to campaign? It was noteworthy that she was in North Carolina also yesterday. Is it Trump upping his appearances? What are you looking for, given the general inscrutability and closeness of this campaign, that might be meaningful?
We haven't talked about it today, but I think that if Harris wins, the issue of abortion and reproductive rights is going to be the reason why, or a very significant reason why. I thought that, putting aside this question of who defined Trump or, how crazy was crazy, in a way, the strongest affirmative part of that debate was Harris's answer early on in the debate about abortion. I think it was probably the strongest debate answer I've ever heard a candidate give. It's very hard in that format to give an impassioned speech that also makes a policy point and a political point that seems genuine, that's within the framework of the rules. It's a very hard format. And given all of that, I thought that, again, it was an affirmative case for her presidency. It was certainly an affirmative case for millions of American women to get out and vote this year. If they didn't know what the stakes were in 2016, well, they damn well know now. She humanized it, not just some of the old cliches of the abortion issue, but I think Harris and Democrats more broadly in the last 2 years since Roe was thrown out have really pivoted the issue to make it one about women's health care and control of their bodies, their families' bodies. I think some of the ads that show young couples who've been, struggling to have children, who, have literally found themselves in a life-threatening situation and been denied health care if they live in certain red states. That's incredibly powerful stuff. It's not the old cliche of some kind of a selfish single woman who doesn't want to have a baby. And again, I thought that was really powerful. There are abortion rights referendum on the ballot in some key states this year, including in Arizona and Nevada, for example. It is an issue that Harris has made her own in the vice presidency more than any other issue. And I think we should mention that in any conversation about what might drive the outcome in the race.
And one more thing, everything you said, and she made him own it. The Trump abortion ban's very effective, where he wants to say, oh, it's just been returned to the states. Thoughts on that? What will actually make this hyperstatic situation look dynamic in your eyes?
I was going to say, what I'd like to see her do is bring the personal passion she showed in that abortion answer and on that issue to the other issues that have the potential to move the 7 remaining swing voters in the country. And that's immigration, fracking. I mean, her fracking answer was a weak point in the debate because she's evolved her position in a, not unreasonable way or in a way that's not hard to understand politically. But there's nothing about her position now that says, yes, this is something she believes and something that I get why she thinks that, as opposed to the polling says she could think that. And I think particularly on the immigration issue, if she can bring some of her prosecutorial passion to the idea of reasonable legal restraint on immigration, it will disarm him to some extent and also have an appeal to a lot of swing voters. It doesn't come naturally because it probably, isn't what she really thinks, but it is a response to a problem in the country, and certainly a political problem she has. So I don't know, it's tough, but she has to be passionate in the center.
My last word is Pennsylvania. It's going to be Pennsylvania. She's either going to have to go to Pennsylvania. Tim Walz is going to have to move to Pennsylvania. They got to be in Pennsylvania. The game is the Electoral College because she's going to win by millions of votes. And the good news is that Wisconsin and Michigan really look like they're going to happen for her. So she's got to get the young voters. I think that endorsement from Taylor Swift and the voter registration is not nothing, and she'll just keep doing it. And look, but at the end of the day, she also has to get those older white voters, which means she has to show herself as stable. And that's why the Dick Cheney endorsement, even though it's annoying to some of us who think of Dick Cheney as perhaps not the greatest of people, it is creating a permission structure for those older white voters.
We got plenty of those in Pennsylvania. I think when I was in Allegheny County, and may still be the case, it was the second oldest county next only to Miami-Dade. Okay, we're just about out of time. A minute for our final feature of Talking 5, where we take a question each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. Abdul was made famous during the debate when Trump had a whole fantasy about getting involved with the head of the Taliban. I told him, Abdul, you can't do that. The question is, who's Abdul? 5 words or fewer, please. Guests.
I'll go. Wherefore art thou, Taliban Abdul?
All right, my answer, I'm apologizing in advance. It has 2 extra words, but it goes to the point of Donald Trump has no frickin' idea who Abdul is. And the way I would put it in your terms is some of my best friends are Taliban.
There is no Abdul.
And I'm going with J.D. Vance with Kafia. Thank you so much, Susan, Molly, and Jacob. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content every day. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, and your support is critical to that. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, Associate Producer Gabriella Glick, Sound Engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu. Thanks very much to Darcy Carden for explaining the Equal Pay Act. It thrills me every week to be able to say our music is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.